Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Thrive Careers podcast. I am your host, Olajumoke Fatiki. Now, let me ask you a quick question. Have you ever taken a personality test before? Maybe Myers-Briggs, the Enneagram, or even DISC, and you walked away thinking, this is not my thing. I'm not just cut out for this kind of role. Yeah, I've been there a few times too. But what if I told you that those results might not be accurate and they might just be holding you back? And today's guest is here to challenge the way we think about personality and, more importantly, how we use or misuse them, especially in the area of our careers. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Dr. Shannon Sauer-Zavala, a clinical psychologist and professor at the University of Kentucky who studies how personality really works, not the pop psychology stuff, but actual research backed practical insights into how we grow, shift, and shape who we are. This episode is for anyone who's ever felt boxed or labeled and is ready to step into a fuller version of themselves. Dr. Shannon, welcome to the Thrive Careers podcast.
Pleasure to be here. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to have you join us this morning. So we have a tradition on the Thrive Careers podcast, and we like to ask our guests, if your career journey were to be a movie, what would the title be and why?
So maybe a lazy girl's guide to success in academia.
Amazing. I love that. A lazy girl's guide to success in academia. I'm wondering how you can really combine those two things. Academia, you have to really be up and do it. So I'm sure you'll tell us a bit more about that as our conversation proceeds today. Thank you so much for joining us on the call today. We're super excited to have you and to help us, broach the subject of personality. All right. So I'm just going to get right into it, and I'll be popping the first question for the day. So let's start with the elephant in the room, personality tests. They are becoming almost standard in hiring and career coaching, but you said that they often miss the good things. They do more harm than good. So can you please walk us through what most people get wrong about personality tests like Myers-Briggs and all the other personality tests that a lot of hiring managers tend to put across the candidates before they join organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So personality tests aren't all problematic, but unfortunately, the ones that have a lot of popularity that have turned into billion-dollar businesses consulting with other corporations and HR departments, those ones are not, there hasn't been a ton of research on them. And the research that has been done, like on Myers-Briggs or Enneagram, suggests that they don't predict career success, that they are about as good at predicting outcomes as your zodiac sign. And so that's sort of the validity of the tests. Often they don't predict what they say that they're going to predict. They're not very reliable. And what I mean by that is people can take the test and get a particular result and then take it again a month later and get a different result. And that's because these tests tend to put us into categories, right? Like I'm an INFJ or I'm an Enneagram 7, right? And people don't really exist in categories, right? We exist on continua. And so you're not an introvert or an extrovert, you're somewhere on that continuum. And so we lose a lot of information when we put people into categories. So those are two kind of like scientific reasons why these personality tests, I'm not a particular fan. In terms of like the effect that I've seen them have. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with patients, and I've had patients come in and we'll be talking about assertiveness, and they'll say, "Yeah, I just can't. I just don't think I can do that because I'm an INFJ." And that's where I really started to see how seriously people took these tests and that are not backed by science, and how they were really limiting people's potential to grow.
Amazing.
But
Thank you so much, for that very important foundation into this topic, and for helping us challenge some of those misconceptions. And I love the way that we are flowing into it already. So let's take this a step further and let's break this down further. This idea of personality, and it's being fixed. I've met a lot of people who like to say things like, I'm just not a naturally outgoing person. And I think I've also said that at some point in my life. Or people who would tell you that I'm not the leadership type, you know. But science paints a different picture, right? So, what does research actually tell us about how much we can shape who we are instead of, putting ourselves in boxes, like you rightly said in your introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one thing I will say is that, in the research of personality, we actually do have valid personality tests that measure sort of where people fall on particular traits of importance. And so, understanding the degree to which personality changes, it's important to have tools to measure it. Unfortunately, I think that the personality tests that we use in our research studies, they could use a PR person, right? Because it's so much more fun to say, like, I'm a Myers-Briggs protagonist than it is to say, I'm, slightly neurotic and outgoing and conscientious, right? Like, it doesn't really roll off the tongue as easily. And so I just wanted to say that we do have valid tools to measure personality. That's kind of a prerequisite to understand like the degree to which personality changes. And so, getting to your question, how much does personality change? And the answer is it varies. So some people change a ton. Some people don't change quite as much. On average, people tend to be less emotionally sensitive as they age. They tend to be more oriented towards relationships. They tend to become more conscientious and they tend to become more open-minded, as we age. And like I said, some people change quite a bit and some people not quite as much.
Okay, interesting. Oh, I thought you were still I thought you were still speaking. As you were speaking, I was trying to recall, a real life experience where we were trying to hire someone into a role in my previous organization. And I think it was a sales role. And we obviously believed in this personality test thing at the time, and the person through, not just one person, quite a number of people had gone through the test. And but this particular person's test came up with the personality claiming not to really suit the sales role, that we're looking at them for. But this was someone who we had spoken to, who was outgoing. There was just that contradiction, if you get what I mean. Speaking to the person, in real life was different from what the personality test was predicting, and we didn't know exactly what direction to go with that particular hire. And it brings me to this question: that what should we really follow our gut feeling in making that decision, or look at the science side of things, like you have been advocating on this? But I don't know if that was really clear.
Yeah, right. So, bottom line, personality can change, right? So, if you feel like you're not, if you would define yourself as more on the introverted side of things and you think like, that wouldn't make me great at sales, right? Like, well, you can actually nudge your personality in the direction that would allow you to really succeed in a role like that. And we can talk more about the actual mechanics of that in a little bit. But essentially changing your personality is really hard. Like, it's doable, but it's not easy. And so you have to have a particular motivation. And so one thing I urge people to do is to consider this. Is a shift like this in line with your values, right? Are you the type of person that has a commitment to justice and leading with integrity, right? And even though maybe you don't feel like right now you have the personality to step into a leadership role, if moving into leadership is connected with the type of person that you want to be or the values that you have, then you absolutely can, right? So we don't have to sort of foreclose on a future that lines up with our values just because we don't feel like we embody those traits right now. And I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's sort of like, it's not really an either or, right? It's not, some people are introverted and they'll talk about it and they'll say like, I just prefer to, work alone, and I, prefer to have fewer friends and just close friends. And I prefer to read my book and not go out as much. And like, if that isn't getting in the way of particular career goals that you have, great. Like, there's no right level of introversion or extroversion. It's sort of deciding for yourself, is it important enough to me and my values to to push myself outside of my comfort zone to change or not?
Okay. All right. So an extra layer to that. So how can people grow the traits that fit into their dream jobs?
Yeah, absolutely. So personality, we've been talking kind of around it, but we haven't actually defined it. And so
Yeah.
personality is your characteristic way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. A lot of people associate their personality with like their essence or their core, their sense of humor, their likes and dislikes. And that's sort of how we use the term colloquially. But in research, personality is your characteristic way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And so it sounds maybe tricky to change your personality, but we actually change how we think about things. We change our habits and we can change our emotional reactions to things that we encounter in life, right? Anyone who's ever engaged in public speaking knows that the first time you do it, it's like incredibly anxiety provoking, right? For most people, whether you're introverted or extroverted, getting up in front of a big audience is often anxiety provoking, right? But then if you do it over and over and over again, most people, that anxiety kind of tapers off. So that's just an example of how, through changing our behaviors, right, putting ourselves out there, we can actually change our emotional responses. And so I mentioned this a little bit before, but like I'm a psychologist, right? So in addition to my work at the university, and my research, I see patients, right? And I use cognitive behavioral therapy. And so essentially, like the cognitive part is change how you think, right? So that really maps on to, your characteristic way of thinking. And the behavioral part is change how you act, right? And that really maps on to the characteristic way of behaving. And so we urge people to to notice if they are engaging in thoughts like, I'm just like this. I'm just a people pleaser. People will be mad at me if I set a boundary. Thoughts that keep you stuck in a particular way of behaving, right? And then, and we come up with new perspectives. We often encourage people to try on or do what we call behavioral experiments. So if you think that you are not leadership material, we might ask you to, your therapy homework would be like participate twice in the next staff meeting and see what happens, right? See if it gets easier over time. And so essentially, if you make changes to your thoughts and behaviors and you maintain them over time, you kind of keep the momentum going, then your characteristic way of thinking and behaving has fundamentally changed, right? And so when you fill out those bubbles on the personality test, they're going to look different than they did maybe, 6 months ago.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing your knowledge on that. So what I hear is it's actually flexible. It doesn't have to be fixed, and you can tailor it into what you want, what your desire is at every point in time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. Thank you. All right. So if in your work and research, what are the traits that actually matter most when it comes to success? Not just climbing a ladder, but thriving in a career that aligns with your values.
Hi, my name's Naomi, and I'm the host of the Notes and Quotes podcast, a space for casual and honest conversations about everything facing young adults today. From mental health struggles to figuring out your future to navigating the climate and social justice crisis of our world. These things should not be faced alone. Come hear me share vulnerable self-reflections, realizations, and eye-opening conversations with incredible guests. This is a community by one 20-something for every 20-something. Can't wait to have you join.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I love that you clarified not just climbing a ladder, but really thriving in a career that aligns with your values. Because in some ways, that's actually the reality of what we're striving for. And in other ways, it makes the question harder to answer because the traits that you would need for success really differ as a function of your values and the career that you want that aligns with that. Generally speaking, people that are higher in conscientiousness, so that's our tendency to be reliable, achievement striving, organized, right? Those people tend to live longer because they go to the doctor. They tend to, make more money. They tend to have higher levels of education, right? Because they have the wherewithal to kind of follow through on things. But there's a point at which becoming too conscientious leads to sort of like rigid perfectionism. So that's not great either. And so, another trait that can be really helpful, I think, is kind of like moderate levels of neuroticism. Neuroticism is a trait that is your tendency to experience negative emotions. And most people think, well, I just want to be really low in neuroticism. But that's not great either because then you don't have that sort of emotional oomph that motivates you and tells you something is important and carries you over the finish line. So I would argue that those might be some of the more important kind of general traits. But then, if you are a graphic designer or an artist or a museum curator, right, you might want to be higher on openness, which is another one of our traits, right? You want to be more open to new ideas and aesthetics. And that might not be as useful of a trait if you are a structural engineer, right? And so that's where we start to think about what are the traits that align with the career that you want? What are your values? And it really is an individualistic process.
In the final analysis, it is an individualistic process. Thank you so much, Dr. Shannon, for broaching that subject. And thank you for clarifying some of those concepts and giving depth, some of those things that we do not really fully understand. So now let's get to the last question for today. And let's say someone is listening and is ready to do the work. Like you have said, it's a personal journey, individualistic, but doesn't know where exactly to start. Maybe they feel stuck in a job that doesn't match who they want to be. How can they start rewriting their traits in the direction of their goals?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. So usually where I encourage people to start, especially if they have taken, sort of random personality tests on the internet, is to start with an evidence-based questionnaire, right? And so there's a couple ways to do that. You can Google, this is where I think psychologists are not great at PR, right? You can Google 5-factor model of personality test, right? Not very catchy. Or I have a free kind of version of the 5-factor model test on my website. So people can go there and take it. www.personality-compass.com, right? And so that's one place to start. And if you take the test on my website, I really tried with the report that you'll get emailed to you to have it be very growth mindset-y. And, here are the pros and cons or the strengths and the deficits or challenges of different traits so that you sort of know where you're starting, right? Because you can't really, if you want to plot a course to somewhere, you have to know where you're starting to kind of know what direction you're headed. Then I usually encourage people to look at folks that they admire. If we're talking about careers, look at folks that you admire in roles that you strive to have, right? And just do a little thinking about or reflecting on, what are some of the traits that they have that make them seem so successful or magnanimous in that role, right? And kind of compare where they are to where you are, right? And that's going to kind of be where you're headed.
Benchmark.
You define that first. Then the process is okay, well, notice any self-limiting beliefs that you have that are keeping you stuck, right? I'm just like this. I'm a people pleaser by nature. People will be mad at me if I say something in a meeting that they don't like, right? Things that are keeping you from, actualizing those traits, right? And then, what would you be if you had those traits that you strive for? What would you be doing more of? What would you be doing less of? And then this is where it gets hard, right? Make some behavioral changes and see what happens. And so the most important part here in terms of that upward cycle of change is paying a lot of attention to what happens next after you make those changes and look for reinforcers, right? How are people receiving you? How are you feeling? Are you feeling pride? Really connect with that because that's going to make you go back the next time and do it again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Shannon. I love everything you said, particularly if there's someone that you really admire. I think that brings it home for me. I would want you to, help us use an example like that, of maybe a client that you've coached that, used this approach and they got results, just to help us, bring it home again, because people sort of connect a lot with examples. So
Yeah.
if you have a story like that.
Well, one example that I have, it's not actually with a client, it's like one of my own examples and thinking about like where I am in my career. So I'm kind of like mid-career, we call it like mid-career when it comes to like academia, which means I am an associate professor kind of in the middle between junior faculty and full professor. And this is a time where there's often a lot of, I don't know, like career angst. I'm sure that that's true in like outside of the academy as well, right? Where it's just, okay, what am I doing? Is this it? And trying to figure out like which direction do I want to go? And one thing I considered was, I've kind of mastered this research thing. I can get grants, I can write papers. Maybe I'll think about moving into administration, right? And so like kind of more of a leadership role. And one of the things I realized that was kind of getting in the way of my leadership journey is that so one of the traits, the important traits that we study is called agreeableness. And it's basically like how well you get along with other people. And I'm really high in certain facets of agreeableness, like empathy and, like kindness and tenderheartedness. But I can't remember what the facet is called, but like I'm low in tact. And I am the type of person that like, if I see, something that feels like unjust happening in a meeting, I'll run my mouth essentially. And turns out people in leadership don't love that. Turns out. So I have a colleague who's kind of at a similar career level to me. And I know she's my friend. And so I know from our conversations that she cares about a lot. She cares about a lot of the same things that I do in terms of like how I think like the department should run or, what would make it a more just or fair situation. But I see her interacting with, leadership, people that are in charge of us. And she has this way of, sort of slowly and kindly bringing things up, I think that is in fact a lot more effective. And so one of the things that I am personally working on is like not feeling like I have to like raise my hand and like speak immediately, right? Like sort of delaying a little bit, thinking about like if I really want to see change, like what's the most effective way to do that? So that's just one example of like how we can look to somebody else and notice like sort of the gap and, is that gap keeping us away from some of our goals and what we might try instead?
Amazing, amazing, amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that example with us. Dr. Shannon, I have one final question for you, and this is very open-ended. I feel strongly that there's something else that might be very strategic to this conversation that I probably haven't brought up, from my questions. And I'm just going to give this over to you. Is there anything else that you think is critical to this conversation that we haven't touched on? And I would like you to just, take that away and share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the big takeaway, I think, for people is not to put yourself in a box, right? And, don't let some like score report from a multiple choice test tell you that you can or can't do something or that you'd be good at something or not, right? Like you are the architect of the life that you want. There is no, I'm just like this, right? If you're really, really introverted, probably you are not going to be like the social butterfly, but like you can push yourself in some situations to, to network, be a leader, to engage in public speaking, right? Like those are things that you can absolutely train yourself to get more comfortable doing. And once you do become more comfortable doing that, it's like there is a little bit of a shift of the trait. And we can do that, with any traits that are not serving us. So that's kind of the first piece. And then the second piece is change is really hard. And so like, it's okay to seek help, right? It's okay to, depending on like what your particular goals are, it's okay to seek career coaching. It's okay to work with a psychologist, right? Like something that's been kind of fun for me in the past, like couple years is that people, it used to be people would be like, I'm anxious, when they would come. And now I've had people come and say, I really want to be more assertive, or I want to work on my neuroticism, like really calling out personality by name. And so really seeing this shift in, it doesn't have to be, the wheels don't have to be coming off the cart before you ask for help. It's perfectly valid to seek help to like self-optimize. And I think that's where I'll leave it.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Shannon. Thank you for, for me, I feel like what you're saying is let's normalize having, asking for help instead of, just trying to figure it out on your own. And whatever that looks like for you, be sure to go for it. Thank you so much. But before we finally let you go today, we have some rapid fire questions for you. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. So, what's one personality myth you wish we could retire from forever?
Because I wasn't ready. Personality that I would retire forever. Just that personality doesn't change, that it's our essence and we can't change it.
Amazing. I like that. So, what's a trait you've had to work hardest to build in your own career?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mentioned this at the beginning with my movie title, like Lazy Girl's Guide to Success in Academia. I did not start out as a particularly conscientious person. People are surprised to learn that I failed classes in high school because I did not go to them, which is just so different from the person I am today, right? And it wasn't really until I found something that I really cared about or that I was good at, until I found psychology, which I just majored in because a random TA was like, you should major in psychology. You did good on this test. So that's just another illustration of how kind of haphazard I was. I started to, as I started to perform well in psychology classes, right, it sort of changed how I saw myself, right? That's that self-limiting belief piece. So I'm good at psychology, right? And that kind of prompted me to continue to apply myself in those classes. When I decided, I'm going to take this on the road. I'm going to go to graduate school for psychology. I was met with some guilt and some sadness because my overall GPA wasn't good enough to get into graduate school because I still didn't apply myself in other areas of my life. Negative emotions can be really positive motivators, right? Because we want to reduce them, right? And so I started to apply myself more consistently. And so over time, my behaviors and my identity shifted, right? It wasn't an overnight shift, but I really worked to become more conscientious. And when those behaviors were reinforced, I would get an article accepted for publication, or somebody would just be like, this was really good. You did a good job on this, right? It kept me moving forward. And now I would say I am staunchly conscientious.
Amazing, amazing stuff. I love that. Thank you so much. So lastly, what's one career advice you think is overrated, but everyone still talks about?
Yeah. Have you heard the one that's you have the same 24 hours as Beyonce? Have you heard that one?
Very common.
I hate that because you know what I don't have? I don't have Beyonce's entourage. I don't have her personal chef and her stylist and all her stuff, right? And so I feel like people will say that, particularly to women, right? You have the same 24 hours as Beyonce, to basically be like, you should get more done. You should be more productive, right? And I don't think, and you mentioned this too, I don't really think success is doing more. It's doing the right things. It's doing the things that light you up, that make you feel alive, that make you feel like you're making a difference, right? And that actually means doing less. So, yeah.
Amazing.
You don't have 24 hours of Beyonce.
I really love that. That is really very valid. Thank you. I'm sure you've liberated a lot of people just with that statement. So thank you so much once again. This was refreshing and mind expanding. Thank you for grounding us in science and reminding us that we are not stuck. We can grow into who we need to become at any point in our lives. So, Dr. Shannon, where can our listeners connect with you, follow your work, or dive deeper into some of the topics you talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am probably most active on Instagram. So that's, what is it? self.made.personality. And you can also find me on my website where I talk about my research, some of my coaching and therapy services. And that is www.personality-compass.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So what would be your final takeaway for our listeners? What would you leave with our listeners as we wrap up this conversation today?
Yeah, absolutely. Let your dreams dictate the traits you develop, not the other way around.
Powerful. No better way to round up this session than with that powerful quote from Dr. Shannon. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. It's been so much fun hanging out with you. And this brings us to the end of today's episode of the Thrive Careers podcast. I hope you've learned one or two things. Be sure to reach out to us on our online space and let us know how much this conversation has expanded your mind and improved even your thinking. Thank you so much. And until I come your way again next time, keep thriving.
And that's it for today's episode of Thrive Careers Podcast. I am Olajumoke Fatiki, reminding you that no matter where you are in your career, you have the power to rewrite your story. If you've enjoyed today's insights, do not forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who's ready to thrive. If you have questions or topics you'd like for me to cover, let's connect. I would love to hear from you. Remember, clarity creates confidence, and confidence leads to success. And until I come your way again next time, stay inspired and keep thriving.